Welcome. This is the Buddhist Medicine and Yoga podcast. I'm here with Lama Karma Justin Wall. He is the director of the Milarepa Retreat Center in Tennessee. And I know him personally as a Karma Kaju, Shankpa Kaju Lama. And, I met Lama Karma through practice. We communicated through email, sat down for some wonderful puer, and then really practice Salung Truk or yoga together, and had some time in the mountains practicing yoga and hiking the paths there. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us. And this is Lama Karma Justin Wall. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, James. Yeah, always good to be with you.
So, for listeners today, we want to discuss some interesting areas of intersection between Vajrayana and completion phase practice, and perhaps healthcare and research. So, Lama Karan, will you tell us a little bit about your work with virtual reality and the death experience? You've walked us through some simulations. So, please, a little bit about virtual reality and the projects that you're working on.
Sure. Yeah. So I work, when I'm not directing the retreat center, building Stupa, doing that kind of Dharma side of things, I'm working for a company called Anuma. And Anuma currently, the focus is on designing and providing experiences, virtual reality experiences for people who have received a terminal diagnosis. And so there's two ways that we do that. One is where that primary person will then invite their family and loved ones, up to 7 other people, and then form a group. And we take them through 6 sessions. One's on Zoom, another on Zoom on the end, and then in the middle there's 4 sessions in virtual reality. And we take them on it's a contemplative journey of sorts. It's also very ceremonial. Very aspects are very ritualized, but the main intention is to really give these participants a chance to talk about what's going on for them, both the primary person, their families, and then another version we do is with a cohort of people who all share a similar diagnosis. And so there's a lot to say about the design and how it works. We just published a paper that talks about preliminary results with a number of cohort groups that we had. And what we found is that in general, what we provide really helps people to reduce their anxiety and depression. Really helps them to reduce demoralization. So this feeling of not knowing what to do or what is meaningful, or not having the kind of spark of life. And so that can really be diminished, and also a lot of sense of connectiveness. And that's really important for anyone facing a terminal illness, whether it's in the context of them recovering, or just being able to die well. That sense of connectedness is really important. So, all of these, are measurable qualities that we've been able to ascertain. But from my own point of view, there's also a very important undercurrent of Buddhist wisdom, which has to be an undercurrent because not everyone who's doing it is Buddhist. And then we have people from whatever, any which faith, tradition, or lack thereof. And so it can't be heavy-handed or overly dogmatic. But at the same time, that undercurrent of wisdom, or that thread, is for me, really the most meaningful thing, that without which I wouldn't really be as interested. And that being, in the context of mortality, who dies, asking that kind of question, but doing that in an aesthetic way that is very beautiful, moving, and connected with others. So really looking at the nature of mind that is beyond death, the unborn aspect of awareness, and trying to, in various ways, point that out and have people have a taste of that, to bring that into whatever might come next in their journey. So that's the VR side. And then At the same time, we have a number of other projects that we're doing in collaboration with other universities, other experiences that we've designed that are, there's another that's more contemplative in nature, some now that I'm developing with the Circle Lab in UVA that are completely contemplative. The Circle Lab is part of the Contemplative Science Center there. We're working on developing a dream yoga program with Northwestern and UVA, and also with Andrew Halicek is collaborating with us. So a lot of interesting, Dharma related projects in VR. And then there's the whole, the clear light, which is more mental health and applying it to people suffering in that way. So it's a bit of a, bit of an overview.
Share with us a little bit about this context. So I'm going to preface with this term pneumodelic, and you use the term aesthetics. So when you took us through this guided experience moving into a more experience of selflessness, so many of us gathered in upstate New York, and you took us through this simulation. And one of the things that I noticed in the papers that you shared, as well as the experience itself, was that the aesthetics didn't focus so much on formal religious iconography, but the aesthetics of the program just got into the feeling sense, or the term that you used was phenomenologically, of dissolution. So I'm wondering if you could talk about how the aesthetics of the VR design or this context kind of helps bring one into these contemplative spaces, and then how that relates to the bardo.
Mhm. Yeah, so the term pneumodelic was coined by my friend David Glowacki. We were childhood friends from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and he's a physical chemist and does computer science, human-computer interaction, and he heads it's called the Intangible Reality Lab in Santiago de Compostela in Spain. And so they focus mostly on applications of VR for science. He, at a certain point, I was in 3 retreat at the time. He was in Spain and he fell off a cliff about 30 meters and punctured his lungs and was basically drowning in his own blood and dying, basically, and had an out of body experience, and then saw his own body in a particular way, and his body is energy, and that energy was slowly dissipating into the environment around him. And particularly, there was a kind of energy at the core, his heart center, you might say, that was throbbing and then slowly diminishing. And then eventually he survived and got picked up by a helicopter and so forth. But after that point, he, in various scientific art projects, tried to recreate what he saw as his own body and recreate the kind of feeling of his own passing. And just skipping forward to the aspects of the VR stuff that we're doing now, he developed an experience called isness, where the aesthetic was a body of light. And that it's kind of like a cloud body, and in the middle of that cloud body there is a glowing heart center, and then there's just kind of indications of the hands as little orbs of lights. But the main thing is that embodiment is cloud-like, and I can't speak to it, but the way that he programmed it was drawing on his expertise in quantum science, that the body is actually just a cloud of probability. There's no there. It's just an appearance of energy, of form, and in its most kind of transparent manifestation. And then, of course, the heart center being this glowing kind of essence, right? And that was all amazing when it came out, and he wrote a paper that was published in Nature, and it was really well received. And he was looking at how that kind of mapped onto psychedelic experience and so forth. And the aesthetic itself was really inspiring for me because as soon as I got in there, it was a kind of you might say a secular form of deity yoga, of generation stage yoga, where there is empty clarity, pure appearance. Now, there's something that appears but is in itself, its essence is empty. And like a rainbow, as many of people who might be watching this are familiar with generation stage yoga, we're generating ourselves in the form of a deity, but there's no solidity to that. So, and then at the same time, there's this heart center, which is the kind of coalescence of that empty appearance. And then from the those of you who are familiar with the Dzogchen tradition, we have these teachings on the seat of Vidya in the body being in the heart, this Mishikpitigre that is residing in the heart. So this is symbolic of that in some sense. So when I was in there, all of this came to me in a really intuitive way. And like you're saying, it's not explicitly deity. There's no attributes. It's just kind of cloud and energy. So that has the benefit, I think, twofold benefit. One is what I mentioned before. You don't have to be Buddhist or a Vajrayana practitioner to get a taste of what generation stage does, and what is the benefit of realizing that this thing that you believe is solid and independent and permanent is actually a flow of energy in space that is also related to other bodies in space. Like, what is the way for a normal person off the street to have a taste of that, and how wonderful that could be. And so a lot of people report just by coming into the environment and feeling their body in that way, there's a relief of, can be chronic pain, can be self-image difficulties, various things that people carry that is also the function of generation stage. So that being the case, the other aspect of deity yoga is then using that body of light to as a segue into releasing all reference point, releasing all concept altogether, and moving into aspects of completion stage. So not only when I came into the environment, that aesthetic was very inspiring, but I also really wanted to see what it was like to dissolve it, to erase it, to have people experience not only embodiment in that way, but also the total release of any identification with that type of embodiment. And so there's a potential there to again give a taste of all of the kayas, where we have this sort of normal, afflicted, confused way of viewing ourselves, and then suddenly we go into what might be called Sambhogakaya. We come into a realm, a dimension where we're with others, and these, the fivefold purity is present. It's a sacred situation. Our body is appearing but empty, and so that entails a dissolution of the normal habit body into a subtle body, then dissolving that subtle body into what may be called Dharmakaya, or maybe experienced as Dharmakaya, and then coming back out of it, re-inhabiting the energy body, then coming back out of VR and re-inhabiting the habitual body, but now you're carrying the insight of Dharmakaya, you're carrying the sensation of Sambhogakaya, and now you are in a totally different place than where you started. And maybe that's Nirmanakaya, an emanation body based on that kind of bodhicitta out of emptiness. And so all of that was there, just ready to kind of to be unfolded. And so that really drove a lot of my inspiration for the development and design work. So that's there's these two aspects, two benefits of the aesthetic. One is that it can give a very sacred and in many cases spiritual experience to people, regardless of their background. And another is that it's non-representational, that it doesn't create more concepts, but is relieving concepts. And that then can lead to the total release of concept altogether. And so, of course, that's really beneficial for anyone facing death. It's very beneficial for anyone who is a practitioner, and is already kind of working with these aspects. It can be very beneficial for people who in the psychedelic world who are having these experiences but can't really contextualize them in a more meaningful, broader framework. So there's a lot of different ways that this can be expressed. And it really boils down to the aesthetic. And the aesthetic really boils down to my friend Dave's direct experience of his encounter with death, and how he expressed that through his training in science.
I believe this prompts a follow-up that will explore the research articles and studies a little more closely, but I want to get into this experience. And just as a note, a couple of years ago, before all these movements and legislation, and perhaps during the pandemic, something that happened was that many came into my clinic dealing with isolation and trauma, and they really came forward with their stories, personal stories around mental health. And as a clinician, it changed my idea about the delivery of healthcare and different approaches to therapy and healing. So I wanted to discuss a little bit about psychedelics then. Can you tell us some ways that you see that psychedelic experiences can help many cope with anxiety or understanding around the death process? What are the prospects that you see, and what do people learn from them? There was a clinician, and unexpectedly, his parents were at the end of life. And I was very surprised that he shared the administration of certain psychedelics and kind of narrated how his parents and his family members benefited. So this kind of opened my eyes. What can you tell us about psychedelics, contemplative experience, and then healing at these crossroads?
Mental health, yeah. And I think there's a lot of overlap between that question and the question in general of the role of psychotherapy, and you could just say medicine in on the spiritual path, right? And so how how does the two aspects of relative healing of our body and our psyche, of trauma, this all of the things that we know ourselves to be that are unresolved, the amelioration of that, the benefit of trying to heal that, and then on the other side, of wisdom and of knowing our true nature, that has nothing to do with how screwed up we are psychologically, how sick we are in our body. It doesn't fundamentally depend on any of that. And when we kind of contextualize the question in those with those two dimensions, I think it can bring a lot of clarity. So to just take the first dimension of call it the relative side, our relational being, how we are in relationship to other people, and historically how our relationships have created our psyche, and at the same time how aspects of those relationships failed us in various ways and actually in some cases harmed us. So much of mental health is really relational in nature, and you're mentioning isolation and so forth during COVID and all of that. And I think a lot of the mental health crisis with youth, use of social media, all that stuff is really boils down to a kind of relational question. So psychedelics can help with that in many ways, uh, and it's important not to oversell it. It's a double-edged sword, but if we think of psychedelic use as a liminal experience, we were talking earlier about that there is this bubble that we live in. It's our habit world. It is defined by our preconceptions. It's totally conceptual, and those notions that we reflect back to ourselves about who we are, those notions about what we project into the world around us, about what it is, it's totally conceptual and it's completely in the thinking mind, right? So that forms our bubble of what we know to be ourselves in the world. Psychedelics will puncture that bubble or just totally put it aside or dissolve it. And so, there's many ways of talking about neurobiologically how that's happening. But to cut to the chase, the fabric or the weave of our conceptual bubble basically dissolves, and then we are able to encounter a way of being that is a little bit less conditioned, a little bit more authentic to what is natural. In the sort of etymological sense of yoga, same thing, coming back to naturalness. How do we do that? We get out of the conceptual mind and into the non-conceptual immediacy of the body. Psychedelics turn on the body and dissolve the conceptual mind. So that in and of itself is really, potentially very beneficial, because then in that liminal journey, that moment that is outside of the norm, we can then experience something that we otherwise don't have access to. And then when we come back, things reconstitute for the most part. But now we have that insight that this is not all there is. This is not all I am. There is something about me that is beyond, that is always before or beyond the kind of affliction bubble that I live in, right? So that's super beneficial. Along with that kind of side of insight, there's also profound potential for connectedness. So connectedness with nature, connectedness with other people, uh, again, that relational quality, being able to see the underlying health in being a human being in connection with others, no matter how problematic our relationships have been up until that point. So there can be deep healing of the ruptures, of the invasions, of the neglect, all of that stuff that constitutes our relational being, because we can tap into something that's underneath that is always and already connected. And there's a sense of wholeness that people report in psychedelic experience. There's a sense of being saturated with meaningfulness. It's deeply meaningful, not because of some concept, but because it just is that way. And you know that, and you can't doubt that. So all that's really wonderful for relative healing. The flip side, the other side of the sword, the other edge, is that then we can create a new identity based on our psychedelic experiences, our liminal experiences, or and along with that, we can privilege that way of being and say, oh, that's the real thing, this expansiveness, this connection, this absence of duality in space and time. Like, I want that, and I don't want this other thing, which is not totally wrong, but in a sense, then we can recreate the whole situation that depends on, taking the substance, having these experiences, and all of that. And so there's a real danger there that I think, as psychedelics become more and more mainstream, needs to be pointed out. And it's not just spiritual materialism. I think there's a much deeper, subtle level to it as well. And so that segues into the other aspect of, the benefits of psychedelics, that there can be transcendental experiences that in and of themselves are what they are, but they can be an invitation to recognize what we might call rikpa, the continuity between what we normally know to be ourselves, transcendental experience, and all experience, waking, dreaming, deep sleep, dying, and all of that. And that we can start to see how that continuity can be drawn out because now we have lots of different reference points, and we can say, oh, that was, I was super high there, and then I crashed super low after that, or my life in general, whatever it might be. And you do enough of that, and something starts to shine through. It's the same in with the path of yoga. States of tremendous activation, bliss, clarity, and non-conceptuality in and of themselves are what they are. But all of the ups and downs, the more we start to experience that, something starts to emerge that is continuity of awareness that doesn't depend on circumstance. So psychedelic can be really helpful in that because it totally blows everything out of the water. And then it all comes back again. And if we don't have any hope and fear about that, something more can start to shine through. And then it's not so much about the psychedelic experience as it is developing wisdom about the nature of experience in general. So these two sides of psychedelics, I think, have a lot to offer. But again, it can go wrong. It can be missed, or it can be distorted.
I wanted to touch on one certain area of this healing prospect. And as a disclaimer, I don't have personal experience with, for instance, ayahuasca, but I do clinically plenty of work around psychedelic integration. And one of the areas that we focus on, because I would say there's a specialization in traditional medicine around working with the vital energy, affect, emotions. So there's a lot of emotional processing as well as a need to restore the body and to help people integrate in this way. So this is perhaps the territory I'm familiar with. My questions are not necessarily prescriptive, but I have experience here. Now, what about the surfacing of traumatic content or experiences, and also contacting emotions, difficult emotional states? Um, how do these practices, as well as something like work with dream or dark retreat or any completion phase practice, how do they start to work not only with this nature of mind or empty ground, but also the shadows and the difficult experiences? How do we work with the unconscious and the difficult emotional content that comes up?
Yeah, and I think it's really a question of the container. And so, the time honored uh, prescription of set and setting, the set of an intention in the beginning, and then the setting is the container in which this unfolds. And that that question of container, whether it's in psychedelic experience or in spiritual practice, is vital. And when and now and so now we're in this context of like, how do we in the modern world create a container for people to work with trauma? And generally the kind of go-to is psychotherapeutic context, the therapeutic alliance, and the whole way in which that which is developed as psychotherapy is held. And I know you're doing that work, whether you are intending to or not, because when people open up in that way, you are getting into that territory of how relationally do we create a safe container for you to re-experience what is most painful, and to do so with a sense of confidence that even if it feels overwhelming, you're not going to be annihilated. And so a lot of times that container is not adequate in the context of psychedelic use. And people can become re-traumatized because there isn't that sense of trust. So that's one important thing. And if the container is created in such a way that it is more clinical in feel, For certain people, that's like the best thing. Like they need to feel like there's a doctor on hand. They're in, a clinical setting, even a hospital. That brings out a sense of trust. For other people, the container needs to have a sense of symbolism, of magic, of ritual, of something that is not clinical. That's the clinical thing is what turns them off, and may actually make things worse. So for some people, there's that other kind of aspect to it. And for some people, it needs to be in the context of, say, the Dharma. It has to be something that's grounded in a lineage, a living tradition of wisdom, that kind of thing. And then that creates a container for them to say, okay, I'm ready to go into these waters that contain that which I fear the most, or that which hurts the most. So that question of container is really important. And you mentioned just the relative side of it, but if we're going to also use psychedelics as initiatory substances that are we're intentionally doing it to discover the nature of reality and self, the container there is commensurably deep, and which means samaya in the context of Vajrayana, that if we're going to be able to go into the depth of our own self-contraction and trust that that process is not going to annihilate us, we need to feel held in something much greater than ourselves, and that we can trust what's going on. And so that I think comes out very directly in dark retreat as well. So dark retreat, you can have that same, you go in for 3 days, the body turns on, trauma comes out, and if the container is well designed, if you have connection with someone who can visit you, who can help you process, or if you have the tools yourself, if the container is there, then on a relative level, that healing can occur in the dark as well. But if you stay in there long enough, it's not going to be enough. And if you stay in there long enough, dark retreat moves from this kind of relative level of potential healing to something that is much more demanding. And there needs to be an anchor of that deep trust in the nature of reality and nature of one's connection with your teacher and so forth. So there's a really strong parallel there as well. But in general, it's really about the container, and most likely with a lot of the people that you're seeing who are dysregulated energetically, or are dysregulated emotionally, it's because there's been a rupture in that sense of trust that then has been reactivated and not contained. And so how to bring back containment and an underlying sense of trust. um, I, I'm not working in that way. I mean, I have done some work with people who are in that state, but um, I'm curious what it's like for you. Does that ring true in terms of creating trust, creating containment, grounding? In that sense, is that basically what you're trying to accomplish, or how do you go about that when you find people in that dysregulated state?
I think it's understanding the stage of the therapeutic process. We care a lot for the body, and we establish this therapeutic alliance. So we work with the relational, interpersonal aspects, and it is also just knowing the subtle body. And that can be informed by Vajrayana and
Mhm.
completion phase practice. But something that's a gift of traditional Asian medicine and these indigenous frameworks is just an understanding of the subtle. Uh,
Mhm.
you have mentioned also the importance of the sacred feminine or the mother. So
Mhm.
before we get into more contemplative topics, I want to just ask, what have you learned through any of these traditional Vajrayana practices or dark retreat, the Bardo, VR? What is, when we acclimate to that ground, what is the role of the sacred feminine, or what are you contacting, and why is it so important in
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it may be. I think there's a number of levels to that. On a superficial level, on the most superficial level, it's just personal. It's like my own woundedness in relationship to the feminine, my own path of integrating that, right? And I think that that is very common in patriarchal culture. I think most people growing up for the last few thousand years in different ways, but just say right now there is a rupture in the relationship with that aspect of the divine feminine, and that plays out in various ways. But I think it's pandemic, and so it's something that I think we all are relating with in one way or another. Ecologically, it's probably the easiest way to see that rupture, but psychologically and socially as well, in the way that our culture relates to the feminine and so forth. So there's a kind of arc that you can trace from one's own personal experience, or I'll just say my experience, that seems very similar in culture, and it has reverberations beyond. And so there's that. And at the same time, there may be, you and I and others like us tend to gravitate towards those of us who are interested in yogic practice in the Tibetan tradition tend to gravitate towards what are called the yogini tantras. And that has deep roots in Indian tantra. And there's different styles of tantra that emphasize different aspects of the body mind. But the yogini tantras, particularly in the Mahamudra tradition, which is where I've been trained most thoroughly, draws its inspiration from the divine feminine. This is, the yogi is the one who, in that context, is creating a temple for the goddess to reside and come alive. And at the same time, in the dark, when we go into dark retreat, as well as with ayahuasca, I would say my experience with ayahuasca is very similar. There is this uncompromising feminine quality, which, even going back to the earliest aspects of the crossover between Mahayana and Vajrayana, wisdom in the Buddhist tradition has been coded as feminine. The empty aspect, the uncompromising gaze of the divine feminine is that which dissolves all concepts, cuts through all superimpositions of ego, and is coextensive with space itself, beyond concept, beyond speech or thought. And so that coding of wisdom, all of that being feminine, shows up in an embodied way. Whether you're practicing the yogas, whether you're in dark retreat, whether you're doing an ayahuasca ceremony, it comes alive in your experience. And there is very, very commonly reported this kind of quality of the feminine, whether that's the dark and wrathful feminine, whether that's the nurturing grandmother, whether that is the accompanying sister or the aspect of the mother. All of these kind of qualities are very commonly reported as experienced. And so it really, again, creates a sense of coherence for me between all of these different things that seem unrelated, or just kind of like a smorgasbord of various deviations that we can get into as modern, spiritual seekers or curious people. That when we start to feel that, you might again say that continuity of the presence of the divine feminine as an underlying guiding principle, it can really help us make sense of what's going on. And then it's also very personal. It's an encounter. There is a dialogue. There is a relationality that can be projected, can be found, outside of ourselves, but then is also a way for us to internally have that dialogue between the energies of our body, the sun and the moon, as they live in our body, and integrating that within ourselves. So, all of that, it's very kind of metaphorical and anecdotal, but that's been my experience, and a lot of that has really informed the VR work as well, and the quality of that. Because when we are approaching death, in the tantric context, it's talked about as meeting the child clear light, meeting the clear light of the mother, like a child jumping into the lap of its mother. And so at the time of death, our own continuum dissolving into and recognizing itself as uh, continuous with great continuum, of the mother, is also really relevant. And so in the VR experiences, I've really tried to have that again as a subtle undercurrent. What is the environment? We're always sitting in a circle. Any kind of representation is very spherical. Um, we're in space, in darkness, with no ground. And all of these are very feminine qualities, the relationality, all of that. So, there is that kind of coherence between all of these different disciplines, you might say.
Contextualization matters. We talked about the view in a way and the importance of set and setting, but the view, when you look at virtual reality and even the arena of psychedelic therapies, you forwarded an article on pure presence as a construct and looking at neural correlates. And I think the question comes up around phenomenology. So we get within this ballpark of non dual experience. And I think for a contemplative, we're also concerned about really fine tuning contemplative experience so that it's not a vague landing into a experience of ego dissolution. So, um, how can we use these tools as well as traditional constructs in Vajrayana frameworks for meditation so that the training can bring us to a more mature and confident experience of our own natural condition in a way that gives rise to freedom, because VR can get us perhaps into this area. Psychedelics, I think the concern is that sometimes the view might be lacking, but
Mm.
with contemplative practice, there's an ethics, there's a training, and those containers. So, so that it doesn't become so vague. How can we enrich the contemplative cultivation?
Hmm. Yeah, I think there's two dimensions to the answer to that. The first is the preparation, and in I really have drawn inspiration from actually Tsongkhapa's three principles of the path. Now, what do we need to do to prepare for esoteric practice? And I'm just kind of making this parallelism between Vajrayana and psychedelics, any kind of esoteric practice. We need to be grounded in the sobriety of what's called renunciation, but just really understanding what is and what isn't valuable, like getting that really clear. We also need to be grounded in bodhicitta, that it's not about us, that it's not our private journey, our trip, our spiritual path. This is really about the awakening of all beings. It's an altruistic, set again. And thirdly, the view, which is what you're mentioning. Having at least in some sort of intuitive aspect or intellectual understanding of emptiness, just as a starting point. It doesn't have to be fully developed, but knowing that that's important. Maybe just knowing that there is a view to be had and that there is something that is correct, and there are deviations from that. So it's not random. It's not nihilistically random. It's not just we're just going to explore reality and see what we find. No, there have been there's a long tradition of people who have been doing this work and have made distinctions between what is to be abandoned and what is to be adopted, and what is authentic and what is not. And then, at a certain point, there's some splitting of hairs, but at least we're going in the right direction. So that's like preparation. And I think that can take care of a lot. Then when we step into esoteric practice, what I found to be super helpful is just the framework of the what are called the four empowerments. That we understand, again, if this is esoteric practice, we're going beyond the normal thing that most people talk about in the world. And this is why psychedelics is kind of disingenuous in a way, because it is an initiatory thing. You're taking initiatory substance and you are occasioning an initiation. But because most people and contexts have no understanding of what that might be, it's just kind of, whatever happens, and you have all of these different experiences, and you may have a vision of reality as a seamless web of interconnectedness that is luminous but yet empty. You may have that kind of experience. You may have tremendous amounts of bliss in the body, awakening of energy in the body, which is potentiating all of that processing of our karma that we mentioned before. You may have tremendous capacity to tune into the vibratory nature of, especially in the ayahuasca context, people have downloads of fully formed songs, prayers, complete with music and lyrics and the whole thing. It's just there. And the whole experience again is very much contained in that vibratory context. So there's all of that kind of going on. You may have experiences of going beyond time. You step into timelessness. You step into total non-conceptuality. You step into experiences that have no reference point, no ground, no beginning, no end. You see that the thing that you believe you were, the ego, is just a bunch of concepts, and that there is a way of being that is not that. People have experiences of that, and a lot of that is the transcendental aspect of psychedelic experience, which is deeply meaningful and so forth. So all of those, it's just kind of out there right now. The way that I just presented it is actually in the context of the first three empowerments. But if you don't have that context, it's just kind of a big mess that, this could happen. You have this insight, you have this aspect of healing, you have this transcendental moment, and there's no coherence to it. There's no sense of a progression, there's no sense of a deepening, and there's no sense of where it might be going. And so the context of the four empowerments can be really helpful because it contextualizes the infinite variety of experiences, of initiatory experiences, and says, first, let's do this. Let's have the vase empowerment. Let's really clarify what it means to be perceiving form, shape, color, our body, and so forth. Appearances. What are appearances? Let us open the door to seeing appearance in a new way. I have to go into this so deeply, but deity, what is that? Mandala, what is that? Then the second empowerment, what is the experience of the vibratory, blissful, deeply energetic nature of that is within appearance, that is within embodiment? And what are all of, like you're saying, having some degree of granularity, of clarifying, this is that, this is that, aspects of the channels, the winds, and so forth, and aspects of the way that manifests environmentally. Having clarity about that, this is the domain of the second empowerment, and these are the types of experiences that are normal. These are things to watch out for. These are things to cultivate, and then folding that in. And then it very easily then progresses to the territory of the third empowerment when all of that is focused into dissolution and aspects of Dharmakaya, of being, of touching freedom from time, space, ego, and so forth. So all of that, if you lay that out in that way, there's a clear progression. There are clear injunctions. There is clarity about what to uh, adopt and what to reject. And then all of that sets one up for the fourth empowerment, which is is all of that and none of that. Where it's really about the view, experiencing the view, the ground becomes manifest. And the fourth empowerment is simply about that same continuity that I was talking about before. Doesn't matter how blissful you are, how obscured you are, all of it doesn't matter, how the nature of your conditioned experience. There is something that has been drawn out through that whole journey that you see, oh, that is ever present. And so this is really important because it's missed in almost every discussion of, especially in psychedelic contexts, but it's missed in a lot of spiritual contexts as well. That spiritual experience, no matter how transcendental, no matter how much you can go actually intentionally control the dissolution experience, whatever you might be having, it's all still experience. And no matter how timeless it may feel, it has a beginning in time and it has an end in time, and you come out of it. So it's not truly timeless if it has a beginning, if the timelessness has a beginning and an end, that kind of thing. What is ever present wisdom? What is timeless, yeshi? What is primordial? Uh, Primordial wisdom. So that fourth empowerment is so crucial in authenticating everything that came before. It is in some ways the culmination, but it's also what really grounds everything in something meaningful. It is where things are going. Of course, it's a bit of a joke and it's a bit circular because it's not a destination. It's seen as the ground of all of that which was arising. But yet there is a logic to it. There's a method, and if we progress through these initiatory experiences and understand them in the proper way, then we can be open to that, that joke, that realization that ever-present wisdom has always been here, and it has always been our nature, and it's not something that we need to create through a process. It's not the product of a process. It's not the something that has been created or built. So those four empowerments, it's not it would be really interesting for me to translate that into something that wasn't bound in the Vajrayana context. I don't know if that's possible, because generally discussing that, let alone teaching that, let alone practicing it, is something that is only done in a relationship with a teacher. So outside of that relationship, how might we use that rubric to benefit people who are not in that relationship, who maybe might become interested in that, but the vast majority of psychonauts and also spiritual practitioners are not interested in that, or don't have a connection in that way. Yet I think there's something to be gained from translating that in a way, everything I just said, to bring some coherence to the journey, right? But anyway, yeah. So is that helpful?
Absolutely. Very grateful because I wanted to facilitate these type of discussions. They can be uncomfortable for some. There are many Vajrayana practitioners that uh, get so much out of their practice and perhaps don't rely on some of these methods. And it's the compassionate intention, especially in healthcare, that many of us or research are trying to bring some of this wisdom or potential into different areas of care. One time you said, hey, I don't also hang out in VR space that much. I see the potentials and the limitations, psychedelics, uh, virtual reality. Um, if you can make a last note, I think just to underscore, what is the ethics of Vajrayana, completion phase, the great completion, as we bring this wisdom into other areas of life and healing? What's a principle of ethics that we can apply that has to do with integrating this wisdom into life and research and healthcare?
I think there's an inherent limitation in that translation into culture. We're losing something, in other words, and then also, of course, there's something to be gained. Um, if we are, if our aspiration is to lose the least amount in that translation, I think the things to draw out or to focus on, to hold as sacred and uh, non-negotiable are, again, bodhicitta. However we might talk about that, it can be limited in the sense of altruism, like we're doing this with an altruistic mind and heart. And then for those that are open, like what is the full fruition of that altruism? Was it's wanting not only temporary benefit for everybody, but full awakening, full flourishing of their potential. That's still a little bit secular language, but that kind of thing. As much as we can, having that be at the core. And then the other thing I would say is the relational nature of it. In the Vajrayana context, it's samaya. It's the sacred bond and relationship between teacher and student, between student and lineage, and so forth. How does that translate into a cultural context? That whatever we're doing is inherently relational in nature. That, and this has to be created many times. Like there isn't a culture of, there is a culture of psychedelics, but there isn't a time-honored culture. There are elders, but there isn't an easy way to know the authenticity of this or that elder. So we actually need to cultivate that. So developing elderhood, you might say, and developing relationality within that, that there are guides, and that the relationship between the practitioner and the guide is something that is non-negotiable. It is a constitutive, essential thing. So, so that can preserve the journey in a way that allows for it to not have as many deviations and allows for it to go much further as well. So those are the first, I've never thought about that question, but those are the first things that come to mind. And then bodhicitta and a sacred commitment, a sacred relationality, something like that. Yeah, I can't think of anything else. Do you have any ideas?
No, I think you touched on some really essential points. The also the intention, bodhicitta, yes.
Mm-hmm.
What is the intention? I think a lot of our mentors, when these questions come up, they bring it back to that point. What's the intention behind the adaptation or the decision? So Lama Karma, Justin Wall, I really appreciate this time together. And there's a project that you're working on, which is a Stupa project. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how people can connect with your work and the community out in Tennessee, etc.?
Yeah, great. Yeah, no, it's kind of like the counterpoint to being in like VR, like this super techy thing. Like it's, concrete structure that the community is building, and up to this point we've done almost all the work ourselves. So it's super earthy, tangible thing that we're doing. And it's really about it's mainly motivated by healing the land. You know, that same thing that we talked about before. You know, this rupture with the natural world. And we're on our land here is right on the border of the national park, the Smoky Mountain National Park. So I really see it as being a kind of stewardship of the land. And the most, you know, powerful way of doing that, or one of the most powerful ways of doing that, is building a stupa to kind of like an acupuncture needle in the earth that really potentiates, you know, the qualities, balances all of the elements, and, you know, brings out the best. And so creating this as an anchor for practitioners in the future, and as a kind of, well, the full name of the center is Milarepa Osel Chozong, so the Dharma, the clear light fortress of Milarepa. And so seeing this as a protective measure as well, that there is some sense of guarding the land, of enriching the land, of giving back to the land, and then and offering that. And so that's the vision, and we're almost complete with the structure, but now we have a lot of work to do with the prayers that go into it. And so we're working on that now, and you can, you know, see the Stupa project on our website, mocd.org. And yeah, and we're in need of funding, and we're in the last phase. So we've demonstrated that it is happening, it's inevitable, but we just need some help. And yeah, that's been my main focus at this point.
So for listeners, I'll put that website in the show notes. And I really hope to have time practicing with you out in the mountains soon.
Yeah, come back. It was great having you visit. And we definitely, so we have a city center in Knoxville nearby, and hosting teachers. And, you know, James was really wonderful to have. I really would love to have you back.
Lama Karma, thank you so much for joining us.